Each week, we take time to share our joys and concerns with one another and to acknowledge that we bring all of who we are into this community of faith. If you're joining us online today, then I invite you to put any joys or concerns you would like to share with the congregation in the comments below. And if you're here, you know there's a book on the table where the bowl with water and the stones reside. You can put any joys or concerns you want shared in that book. But there are a couple of off-book things that I want to mention today. And one is I want to introduce you to Kimberly Clough, who I see back here. Kim, would you stand up and wave? This is our new religious education coordinator to help out Alan on Sunday mornings. You'll see Kimberly around busy downstairs. She might be in a lot of different fill-in roles, but mostly what she's going to help us do is coordinate all of the volunteers with the religious education program and to make sure that we have all of the adult assistance that we need in all of the spaces where we need them. And so we're really grateful to welcome her onto our team. We also I particularly have some gratitude for last week's service, and I just want to lift up the Pride for All Ages group and thank them for the lovely job that they did with last week. And a special thank you to our ad hoc safety team that you may not have even noticed, but who were on special alert last week to make sure that there weren't any disruptions, and thankfully they were not needed at all, but I appreciate their presence and their willingness to serve in that capacity. Thank you. We also acknowledge that as we gather here today in a peaceful room, there are human beings suffering because of human violence in many parts of the world. And so our love and care and compassion go out to those in Israel, in Palestine, in Ukraine, and elsewhere where human violence continues to cause great suffering. What else do you carry with you today? I invite you to come forward and place a stone in the water for any other joys or concerns you'd like to acknowledge. place a stone to acknowledge all of those joys and concerns shared with us online today. And a final stone for those things that may still be working their way through our hearts. You know you're in for it when the minister brings a snack in for the service in case it runs long. I'm curious. We live in lots and lots of different places. We come here to this space to worship together, but folks live all over the place. I wonder how many people live in Shaker Heights. Just show of hands. There's a few. Okay, that's great. Did anyone go to school in in Shaker Heights? Who went to school in Shaker Heights? Oh, there's a few. Does anyone here know your kids did? Okay, so you might know this even if you didn't go to school here. Does anyone here know the Fernway song? Would you be willing to sing the Fernway song? No? No. It stuck with you, though. Okay, so we won't put Jean on the spot. Thank you for being willing to say no. It's always an invitation, never an obligation. What else? Think about elementary school. What did you learn in elementary school that has stuck with you? Probably a few things. Yeah, go ahead. The golden rule. What is the golden rule? Treat others how you want to be treated. We learn it in elementary school, and it sticks with us. How to sound out a word phonetically. You can still do it right now if you had to. And with Unitarian Universalist hymns, you might have to. We learn a lot of things. Yeah, go ahead. Sit down and be quiet. That's not something that a lot of people in this room have retained from elementary school. That's what you remember. You remember being taught that. Sometimes that's right. I see in the back, Lori, go ahead. And you can still do that right now? How to swing high enough on a swing so that you can launch yourself into space. Yes. We learn important things. Yes. The American traditional colonial story about Thanksgiving, and you could probably tell us all right now what that is because you learned it when you were in elementary school. Yeah, go ahead. Say it one more time. Pay attention. Pay attention. One more. The Pledge of Allegiance. We could probably all recite that from elementary school. To say a prayer whenever you heard an ambulance go by. Do you still do that? It did stick with you, yeah.
Two versions of the Pledge of Allegiance.
Two different versions, yes. Depending on when we were in elementary school, we might have learned different things. Things stick with us. Sometimes things stick with us, even though we don't expect them to. We have experiences and we bury them, and other things in life happen, and we don't think about them, and we think we're done with it. We're talking about heritage this month, and we're talking about the heritage of this place today. But sometimes there are things that we bury. They're not delightful things like how to swing high enough that you can launch into space. There's sometimes some painful things that happen in elementary school that we think, I'm just going to bury that and it's not going to matter anymore and it's not going to affect me. And then life shakes things up. Do you know this trick? Some of you are smiling because you know what's going to happen. And it gets to the top. I had the lid on so you know I wasn't playing any tricks on you. It comes right to the top. Because when life shakes you up, sometimes those things that you think are buried, you get them way deep down and you cover them up and you say, that's not going to affect anything anymore. You have to put the lid on the right way. Life brings it back up to the surface. So when that happens, we need to do something with it. So when we talk about the history of this place, when we talk about perhaps traditional colonial stories about the way things are or were, when we talk about things from our own histories, when things keep bubbling up, it's not always pleasant, it's not always happy, but they keep bubbling up because we need to do something with them. And so in all of our stories about legacy and heritage, I hope that you remember this is not about anything that we're supposed to feel ashamed of. It's not about anything that we're supposed to feel responsible for that we didn't do, but it's about an opportunity to do something meaningful based on our values with the things that keep bubbling up in our lives. I don't know if you want to eat any of this, but we'll find other popcorn if you need it.
I see there is not a QR code on the order of service, so you can stop looking for it. I guess we're not doing that right now. 80% of the plate collection each week is donated to a worthy nonprofit. Our plate partner this week is Signal Cleveland, which was the subject of one of our recent forums, and they are available on YouTube. Launched 1 year ago, Signal Cleveland is an independent, community-led nonprofit newsroom. Their motto is, "For people, not for profit." It is backed by an initial grant from the Cleveland Foundation, as well as a coalition of Ohio organizations, community leaders, and the American Journalism Project. Signal Cleveland's goal is to produce authoritative, trustworthy daily journalism across a range of topics. Unlike Cleveland.com, they fill big gaps in news coverage that too often overlook people and issues in the city of Cleveland and its inner ring suburbs. They are a primary source of information for residents who may not otherwise have access to trustworthy journalism. The twice-weekly newsletters are available online, via email, and on social platforms. The website has explainers and guides to help residents navigate life in Cleveland. They also hold community gatherings and trainings, such as how to make a presentation to City Council or other official bodies. It's about building comfort level and giving voice to the residents. Signal amplifies the diverse perspectives and stories of Greater Clevelanders. They help them make informed decisions and hold people in power accountable. They respond to questions like, what the heck is issue 1, the August issue 1, and how do I pay my utility bill? They cover the Cleveland schools K through 12 and community events in the neighborhoods. Currently, there's a focus on the central neighborhood, one of the poorest in Cleveland. To help accomplish all this, Signal Cleveland is home to Cleveland Documenters, a group of about 500 Greater Cleveland residents who represent almost every zip code in the county. They are trained and paid to document local government and other public meetings with notes and live tweet threads. Their reports are written up by reporters and shared in short, easy-to-read briefs. Please join a host of other socially aware individuals with a donation to the work of Signal Cleveland. You may place it in the plate as it notes in your order of service, or you can donate through our Cash App. Or you may send a check to the church, writing plate collection and today's date on the memo line. This reading, as you can see, is by the estimable Isabel Wilkerson. I love old houses. I've always lived in old houses. But old houses need a lot of work. The work is never done. Hold your hand if you know that. Just when you think you've finished one renovation, it's time to do something else. Something else has gone wrong. That's what our country is like. You may not want to go into that basement, but if you really don't go into that basement, it's at your own peril. Whatever you are ignoring is not going to go away. Whatever you are ignoring is only going to get worse. Whatever you're ignoring will be there to be reckoned with until you reckon with it. And I think that's what we're called upon to do where we are right now.
Laura Meckler recently published a book called Dreamtown that is about racial equity in Shaker Heights. It's very specific to where we are. There would be no other Unitarian Universalist congregation in the country where it would be more appropriate to talk about Dreamtown than right here. And many of you know this story. Some of you have lived this story. Some of it was relayed to me when I chatted with the search committee a few years back when we were first getting to know one another. But some of this story was new to me, and maybe it's new to you too. You may know that the Van Swearingen brothers, without putting up any of their own money, developed this land of Shaker Heights into a meticulously planned suburban community for wealthy white homeowners. They bought a railway company just to ensure that there would be a convenient line that would run from Shaker Heights into downtown Cleveland. And I say they bought a railroad. They didn't do that on their own dime either. Their entire enterprise was built upon this interlocking system of holding companies that was dependent on a mountain of debt. And when that mountain collapsed, they were bankrupt. But for a while, Shaker Heights was looking like a utopia for rich white people. There were strict conservative rules for everything. In fact, it was the first time that developers had set such rigid control over such a large residential area. And excellent schools were part of that plan. We'll get to that in a sec. But 100 years ago, Shaker Heights was off limits to Black and Jewish and Catholic buyers, although occasional exceptions were made for Jews and Catholics. A couple of Black buyers did slip through those restrictions early on, but they were driven away pretty quickly by open hostility. And homeowners were pressured soon thereafter into adding a clause to their deeds that forbade them from selling to any, quote, undesirables. We've been talking about race in code for a long time, and it's a really obvious code. You ever wonder why we start talking about some things in coded language? It's not to hide what we're talking about, because it's obvious what we're talking about. I suspect that we know that something is wrong with what we're doing. We experience some kind of internal conflict, and so we would feel too guilty about saying it outright, so we try to hide it a little bit and disguise it. We bypass that internal conflict by using coded language that really doesn't conceal anything at all. That's my suspicion. I may be wrong. But back to the history of Shaker Heights. Dr. Edward Bailey, a member of the Black elite, moved into Shaker Heights in 1925. And it scared people so much that the Shaker Heights Protective Association was formed. This was not a city ordinance group. This was a special association that set to work weaving a set of rules and restrictions that were intended to prevent any more black buyers from ever being able to own a home in Shaker Heights. And these restrictions worked for decades beyond the 20s. They were still in place when this property was purchased by First Unitarian back in the 50s. The church thought that it was a safe investment because of the many restrictions put in place by the Van Swearingen Company. And the congregation was divided. There was a little bit more than half of the congregation that wanted to move closer to where many of the families in the congregation lived, in the wealthier suburbs. And there was a little less than half that said, we really want a congregation where all members would be regarded as equal, regardless of their color or national background or social position. And Shaker Heights at the time did not seem like that kind of environment. That is why, if you hear about a reunified congregation, Unitarian Universalist Congregation of Cleveland is a reunification of those two divided opinions about where to be and what kind of community we want it to be. And hopefully now it is more feasible for us to be a place where members are regarded as equal, regardless of their color, national background, or social position in this geography. But back then, in 1956, John and Dorothy Pegg, a black family, moved into Shaker Heights, and they had their garage bombed in an attempt to scare them off. And when I say they had their garage bombed, I mean there was an explosion, the equivalent of 10 sticks of dynamite, that went off on their property in 1956. But white residents of Shaker Heights were not all in accord with this. They didn't all agree with that behavior. Some were appalled by their neighbors' behavior, and they took cookies and coffee and they helped clean up the debris at the Pegg residence. The Peggs received hundreds of letters and phone calls the first few weeks that they were here after moving in, and most of those communications were welcoming. This was in the Ludlow neighborhood, and this began the Ludlow Community Association, a group of residents who were determined to be a successful, integrated community. Now, Meckler details all of this in her book, and she includes a short paragraph from Beverly Mason, one of the first residents to challenge racial segregation in the Shaker Heights School District. Here's what Meckler says. Discrimination was not the only thing that created challenges for people like Mason. White residents embraced a colorblind philosophy that felt progressive to them at the time, but could leave some black people feeling unseen. Beverly Mason says, I always felt like the white people in Ludlow did not want to acknowledge that we were black. I never felt like they were unkind. In fact, they were quite the opposite. But I always felt like I wasn't there. They accepted me as another person, but never looked at me as black. Now that might be hard for some of us to hear, that the thing that we consider right, being colorblind, not judging someone by the color of their skin, that leaves some people feeling invisible and not fully welcome. It's like we're ignoring or erasing a really meaningful part of that person's identity. And in some cases, it can turn into that old story that you're welcome to be in our space, but it's never really going to be your space. As long as you can act like us and talk like us and do the things that we do the way that we do them, you're welcome to be a chameleon in our space. But you will never be in a position to welcome us the way we are welcoming you. But in many ways, the Ludlow Community Association was very aware of color. They knew the familiar story of neighborhoods. Black family moves in and white families run. And then more black families move in because realtors won't even show homes to white families once white families start running. And then you have a segregated neighborhood. And the Ludlow residents didn't want that. They wanted to be a successful, integrated neighborhood. And so they intently worked to keep a balanced proportion of black and white residents, to the extent that they encouraged black buyers to look elsewhere so that they could attract the right number of white buyers. They didn't just turn people away. Okay, sometimes they just turn people away. But they didn't feel good about sending black homeowners, black buyers away. And so they encouraged the integration of other neighborhoods because they didn't feel good about turning people away. And over time, their plan worked. All of the fear-based rules and restrictions of the original city plan were challenged because a group of committed people were willing to live by a set of principles that went deeper than their fear of other human beings. And members of First Unitarian that occupied this building were divided throughout the 60s. There were people like Robert and Barbara Haas Rawson, who publicly promoted open housing. They wrote letters to the mayor that he then turned around and published without their consent with his own commentary about pious liberals. We had people like Stuart Wallace, who was actively integrating neighborhoods as a realtor guided by his Unitarian Universalist values. And yet many people in the congregation feared diversity, and they resisted anything that looked like a political stand. Some would say that the church disbanded the youth group at the time because of their fear of diversity. We've had a hard time recognizing that a theological call toward justice is a political stand. We cannot bend the moral arc of the universe toward justice without confronting political systems in one way or another. And we've come a long way since then. We're not at the end of the road, but we can celebrate some distance traveled. Even as neighborhoods intentionally and strategically desegregated themselves, though, equity and integrity has been an ongoing challenge in the Shaker school system. And Meckler suggests that this feeds challenges in the larger community because the things that we learn at a very young age stick with us. And it's not just about school songs, and it's not just about the Pledge of Allegiance. It's about our worthiness and about what we're capable of being in our lives. It sticks with us, and it guides how we are in our relationships with other adults in our communities. Systemic practices, negative stereotypes, and false assumptions about race have meant that advanced classes in Shaker schools persistently held a disproportionate number of white students. And if it needs to be said, it's been demonstrated time and again that it's not just because there is a disproportionate number of capable, intelligent white students in the school system compared to their black peers. The result is that white students, even if they're average students, wind up being better poised to get into the college or university of their choice and succeed in a degree program and better opportunities beyond education. And it means that black students are often not given the same degree of attention and preparation to even consider what their college or university of choice might be unless they and their families are willing to do that research on their own. Historically, according to Meckler's research, white parents understood the system better, and they knew how to work it. They would demand that their children be in more prestigious classes, and they would rail against anything that might not make their child look competitively superior to all the other college applicants. And historically, black parents are more likely to live further away from a school because of the busing system that was designed to create a more integrated school. It meant that those black parents had less access. They didn't have the same connections. They didn't have the same power to make demands of the school system. Now, that's painting with a broad brush, but that's essentially what Meckler discovered about the long struggle toward racial equity in the Shaker schools. And sometimes inequities persist because people just don't know what to do. Time and again, we lift up the problem, and school officials have said, yes, we know. What do we do about it? We would love to fix this problem. There have been people all throughout the history of the school system in Shaker Heights who have moved things toward equity. And some of them have stepped into their roles knowing that equity was going to be a focal point of their jobs. And some of them experienced a wake-up call that shook them into awareness. And one of those people that Meckler reports about is Eric Tooley, high school principal hired in 2019. We're not talking about the 60s anymore. I'm sorry. We're talking about just a few years ago. May 30th of 2020, 5 days after George Floyd was murdered by Minneapolis police in broad daylight, someone took a can of spray paint to the red brick walls of the Shaker Heights High School in emotional protest. with anti-police slogans and other messages about the racism of our country. And Eric Julie responded with a long and searing letter to the community. The high school could not just be a non-racist place, he said, echoing the ideas expressed by historian Ibram X. Kendi. It had to be an anti-racist place, a place actively working to combat racism and promote policies that produce and sustain racial equity. Shaker, Julie said, was filled with passionate teachers and amazing students, but problems so easily identified in central cities existed here too. We have black classes and white classes, Julie wrote. We have lots of struggling students in far too many segregated classrooms. And then he made a confession and a commitment. He wrote, I need to leverage my power and privilege to stand up for racial justice. I know that I can do better. This was just a few years ago, an awakening of somebody that recognizes power and privilege as a tool to be used toward justice and not something to hide or be ashamed of. And there are lots of mindful people seeking solutions to problems that have been identified many times over. While she was researching the book, Meckler watched a parent-teacher organization meeting at Fernway Elementary as the group considered the suggestion that students bring a flower to their teachers for Teacher Appreciation Week. And the principal immediately noted that communication with black families at the school, most of whom were bused from nearby neighborhoods, communication was not great with those families. Would they all get the message? What I don't want, the principal said, is all the white kids show up with flowers while the black students don't. So one of the mothers suggested that instead, the PTO moms might stand outside the school with buckets of flowers so that each kid could take one to bring to the teacher, finding a creative, equitable solution while still being able to do the thing that they were hopeful to be able to do. And Shaker Heights has changed. 30 years ago, the typical black household in Shaker earned about 65% as much as the typical white household. By 2020, white median income had risen, while black families' income had dropped to 35% of that of white families in Shaker Heights. Moreover, the portion of black Shaker Heights families living in poverty had nearly tripled, approaching 15%, while white poverty inched up toward 4%. Equity in a system requires not putting unreasonable expectations on the parts of the system that are already struggling. Equity in a system requires not putting unreasonable expectations on the parts of the system that are already struggling. Equity means that we embody our values over a contrived sense of advantage. And so I want to offer three possible responses. Now, one is you can just read Dreamtown if you like. There's a lot more information in there than I can pack into a brief sermon. That's not really number one, but if you're curious, read the book. It's out there, it's available. It's a good read. But the first thing I'll offer is to remember that your experience is not everyone's experience. The things that come easily to me or challenge me probably are not the same things that come easily or challenge everyone around me. And it's difficult for us to gain that perspective unless we are in relationship where we can listen deeply to other people's stories. And when I say building relationship, I mean relationship with other human beings who have different life experiences from our own. I know that every nonprofit organization you contribute to talks about the relationship that you have with them. Justice is about more than giving a few dollars to a nonprofit and feeling good about it. Your money is great. Your money is really, really useful. I'm sure that it does a lot of good in the world. And also, throwing money at this particular problem has not seemed to end systemic inequities. So we need to be in authentic, vulnerable relationships with human beings whose life experiences are different from ours if we want to truly understand what we mean when we say, in this congregation, that we have a fierce commitment to justice. So remember that our experience is not everyone's experience. The second thing is we have got to stop treating life like a competitive event. So many of the problems that Meckler points out in the school system Seems like so many problems everywhere else. They persist because too many people are afraid of losing something. We build a system where some people have advantages and some people have disadvantages, and then we learn to navigate that system so that we win. Our values are not about ensuring that we win and other people lose. Our values are about mutual thriving. And if you can't conceive of the possibility of mutual thriving, maybe that is your next step personally. We cannot build beloved community based on the illusion of elitism. We either all win together or we all lose together. There's nothing in our set of values that glorifies navigating a flawed system better than anybody else. Our Unitarian Universalist identity calls us towards something more challenging and more rewarding. And the third thing is, if you're there, if you're already saying amen in your head, because Unitarian Universalists will not say that out loud in a worship service, if you're there, get involved, do something. Don't just let this be a thought experiment for you. You can get involved in the Shaker school system, I'm sure. There are ways that our congregation could do more to support the common mission of racial equity in our local community. But you live in a place that has the same kind of challenges. All of our communities have these challenges. Your neighborhood, your school system, your workplace, wherever you are, there are opportunities for you to use whatever power and privilege you possess in a meaningful way. And if you want to do it here, I might just mention that we have a program called Impact that would love to have you volunteer a couple of times a month on a weekday afternoon. And let me just say something about Impact. It was not started as a ministry toward students of color, but that's what it has become. And there was a moment, there was a crossroads that this congregation faced when it had to realize that this program had become a ministry toward students of color. And my understanding is that we almost made the same mistake that we made back in the 50s and 60s. We almost dismantled a program because we were afraid of diversity, but we didn't. We reached the same crossroads, and we made a different decision. And now we have a thriving program that ministers to students of color from the middle school that you can be a part of if you want to be. We've also got a relationship with FDR School, and that's not here in Shaker Heights, but that's also a relationship that is established with this congregation, and that is not only meaningful and effective for the students there, but it is apparently a lot of fun based on the posts that I see on our Facebook page by the volunteers. So you can get involved with either of those programs that are already here at the congregation. So remember, your experience is not everyone's experience. Build vulnerable, authentic relationships with people who have had different life experiences from you. Commit to mutual thriving and resist treating life like a competitive event. And get involved where you live, work, play. Especially remind the children in your midst of their inherent worthiness, because they will remember. And that will be what bubbles up over and over again in their lives. I'm not saying give until it hurts. I'm not saying sacrifice your own well-being for the sake of others. I'm suggesting that we all have opportunities to influence the world around us if we are willing, and those opportunities are literally at our doorstep. May we have the vulnerability and boldness of spirit to embrace those opportunities and build beloved communities where all thrive. Amen, and blessed be. You did it. Oh my goodness. I have to write to all of my UU clergy friends and say that you said amen in a worship service. Oh, you trendsetters. Well, in light of that, I invite you to rise in body or spirit as we sing Building a New Way. It's in the Teal hymnal. It's number 1017. Let's sing together. let me tell you a couple of other things that are happening around here. You know our auction is coming up on November 4th. Tomorrow is the deadline for items. We have maybe a little fewer than in the past in terms of dinners and events and that sort of thing. So if you've got kind of an idea for a thing, then make sure you get it in by tomorrow. We also have a potluck coming up on November 12th, and we would love to have an organizer for that. The room setup is already handled by staff, but it would be great to have somebody to organize that a little bit. We have a sign-up genius already. We use that for our Wednesday evening suppers, which you also are invited to, 6 p.m. on Wednesdays. So it should be an easy job if you're interested in organizing that potluck. On this Wednesday evening, after our supper at 6, you're invited to carve pumpkins if you are so inclined. We invite you to bring your own pumpkins. We are not supplying the pumpkins. But we'll have some time to carve pumpkins together after supper on Wednesday. You will notice a lot of things in the newsletter about things that are coming up. We've got a Samhain celebration at 6 p.m. on the 29th. That's in the newsletter. There's also something about our program with the Adoption Network Cleveland on a book titled Relinquished. That's going to involve a Zoom on the 30th and then an in-person discussion on November 5th. Both of those require registration. So please go to our website. In the forum section of our website, you'll see how to sign up for those Relinquished events. And Kathleen Bennig is going to be, I've got one of the forms over here so that I could show you, and then I put a bunch of stuff on top of it. Kathleen Bennig is going to be in the fellowship hall again today with forms. Kathleen, you want to wave? There's Kathleen in blue. This is from the membership committee for the past year. The membership committee has been attempting to update UUCC's membership files. You may have already filled this out. If you have, thank you for doing so. And there's also a little form you can hang on your refrigerator and make copies to give to family and friends to keep with your important papers. So she'll be in fellowship hall today. Oh, and next week we have special musical guests. The harpsichord is being tuned, and we are going to have some special music beginning at 10 a.m. next week. So plan to arrive early for next week's service at 10 a.m. for some amazing music. I think that's all that I can possibly cram into your brains right after a service. May we take to heart the opportunities before us, and may we use whatever is at our disposal to create greater wholeness and well-being for the world around us, understanding that as we do so, we create greater wholeness and well-being for ourselves. Go with peace and courage. Amen.
Blessed be. Before we extinguish our chalice, I do know that there are some new people here today, and I just want to point out that if you go downstairs, either from the front or from the back, we have a social hour, and you may meet some new people and ask some questions and get them answered. You're welcome. We extinguish our chalice from the yellow pew card. We extinguish this flame, but not the light of truth, the warmth of community, or the fire of commitment. These we hold in our hearts until we are together again.